The House Oversight Committee hearing room was already buzzing with anticipation long before the gavel struck. It was one of those rare days in Washington when the air itself seemed charged, as if everyone present could sense that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras trained on the witness table, while staffers whispered in the aisles, trading predictions about who would come out on top in the day's most anticipated exchange. At the center of it all sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, her posture composed, her eyes scanning the room with a quiet confidence that belied the storm she was about to face. Across from her, Representative Matt Gaetz, the Florida firebrand, known for his relentless partisanship and headline-grabbing theatrics, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. For weeks, the committee had been preparing for this hearing, billed as a critical examination of government oversight and accountability. But everyone knew the real draw was the inevitable clash between Crockett and Gaetz. Their previous encounters had already become the stuff of viral legend. Clips of their sharp exchanges had racked up millions of views, sparking debates on cable news and social media alike. Today, though, the stakes felt even higher. The topic at hand, allegations of misuse of federal funds in border security contracts, was contentious enough. But it was the personalities involved that promised fireworks. As the clock ticked toward the start of the hearing, the room filled to capacity. Every seat was taken, and a line of observers snaked out into the hallway. The committee's chair, Representative Linda Sanchez, called the meeting to order with a firm rap of her gavel. "This hearing will come to order," she announced, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "Today, we will hear testimony regarding the allocation and oversight of federal funds for border security initiatives. I remind all members to conduct themselves with decorum and to respect the time allotted for questions." The opening statements were, as always, a formality, each side staking out its position, laying the groundwork for the real battle to come. Gaetz, true to form, wasted no time in making his presence felt. "Madam Chair," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "I hope we're not here to conduct another partisan witch hunt. The American people deserve answers, not political theater." His words drew a few chuckles from his Republican colleagues and a collective eye roll from the Democrats. For her part, remained silent, her expression unreadable. She had learned long ago that the best way to deal with provocateurs like Gaetz was not to rise to the bait, but to wait, patiently, methodically, until the moment was right. She had come prepared, her questions meticulously researched, her evidence organized in a thick folder at her side. She knew that Gaetz would try to dominate the exchange, to interrupt, to deflect, to turn the spotlight on himself. But she also knew that the truth, when delivered with precision and conviction, had a way of cutting through even the loudest noise. The first hour of the hearing passed in a blur of testimony and cross-examination. Witnesses from the Department of Homeland Security and the Government's Accountability Office fielded questions from both sides, their answers often drowned out by the partisan back and forth. Gaetz was in rare form, peppering witnesses with rapid-fire questions, interrupting their answers, and launching into monologues about government waste and bureaucratic incompetence. His supporters in the gallery nodded approvingly, while his critics shook their heads in exasperation, but it was clear to everyone in the room that the main event had yet to begin. As the chair recognized Crockett for her allotted 5 minutes, a hush fell over the chamber. She adjusted her microphone, glanced briefly at her notes, and began. "Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to direct my questions to Representative Gaetz, who has been quite vocal about his concerns regarding oversight. Congressman, you've repeatedly claimed that federal funds allocated for border security have been mismanaged. Can you provide specific examples of contracts you believe were improperly awarded?" Gaetz leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Congresswoman, I'm glad you asked. In fact, I have a list right here." He began to rattle off a series of contract numbers and dollar amounts, his voice rising with each example. But before he could finish, Crockett interjected, her tone calm but firm. "I appreciate the details, Congressman, but I'm asking for evidence of actual wrongdoing, not just large numbers. Can you point to a single instance where a contract was awarded in violation of federal law?" The first interruption? Gaetz cut her off mid-sentence, waving a stack of papers in the air. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, if you'd let me finish, I could explain how these contracts—" Crockett held up a hand, her expression unchanging. "I'm not interested in explanations, Congressman. I'm interested in facts. Was there a violation of law? Yes or no?" Gaetz bristled, his voice growing louder. "You're missing the point, Congresswoman. The problem isn't just legality, it's the waste, the inefficiency, the lack of accountability." The second interruption. Crockett didn't flinch. "Congressman, I'm reclaiming my time. Please answer the question." The room was silent, all eyes on the two lawmakers. Gaetz, clearly frustrated, tried again to steer the conversation back to his talking points. If you want to talk about accountability, Congresswoman, maybe you should look at your own party's record on border security. The Democrats have the third interruption. Crockett's voice was steady, unwavering. Congressman, I'm not here to debate party politics. I'm here to get answers for the American people. Please answer the question. A ripple of tension passed through the room. Even the chair seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Gaetz, undeterred, pressed on. The American people deserve to know why billions of dollars are being spent with so little oversight. If you're not willing to hold your own party accountable, the fourth interruption. Crockett leaned in, her eyes locked on Gaetz. Congressman, this is my time. I will ask the questions, and you will answer them. For a moment, Gaetz hesitated, his bravado faltering. But then he recovered, launching into yet another tirade about government waste and democratic hypocrisy. The fifth interruption. Crockett waited, letting him finish, then spoke with a quiet authority that commanded the room. Congressman Gaetz, you have now interrupted me 5 times. 5 times you have refused to answer a simple question. The American people are watching, and they deserve better. A hush fell over the hearing room as Jasmine Crockett's words echoed through the chamber. The tension was palpable, the kind that makes even seasoned reporters sit up straighter and scribble furiously in their notebooks. For a brief moment, even Matt Gaetz seemed at a loss for words, his usual swagger replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Crockett didn't gloat or raise her voice. She simply let the silence hang, a silence that spoke volumes about power, respect, and the expectations of public service. The chair, sensing the gravity of the moment, leaned forward. The gentlewoman from Texas has the floor, she reminded, her voice gentle but firm. Crockett nodded in acknowledgement, then turned her attention back to Gaetz. Congressman, I'm going to ask you one more time. Can you provide a single example of a border security contract that was awarded in violation of federal law? Yes or no? Gaetz shifted in his seat, his eyes darting to his notes. For the first time, the bluster seemed to fade, replaced by a hint of discomfort. He cleared his throat, searching for a way to regain control. Congresswoman, I think it's important to recognize that sometimes the law itself is insufficient to prevent waste. Just because something is technically legal doesn't mean it's right. Crockett didn't interrupt. She simply waited, her gaze unwavering. The room seemed to hold its breath, the only sound, the faint hum of the air conditioning. Gaetz, realizing he wasn't going to be rescued by another outburst, finally relented. No, I cannot point to a specific contract that was awarded illegally, but I stand by my concerns about waste and mismanagement. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some of Gaetz's supporters looked away, while others doubled down, muttering about deep state cover-ups and partisan witch hunts. But the energy in the room had shifted. Crockett had done what few had managed before. She had forced Gaetz to admit, on the record, that his accusations were not backed by evidence. But Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice soft but resolute. Thank you for your honesty, Congressman. Now, let's talk about oversight. You've been very vocal about the need for transparency and accountability. I agree with you. That's why I've introduced legislation to strengthen independent audits of federal contracts, regardless of which party is in power. Will you support this bill? Gaetz, caught off guard, hesitated. I'd have to review the specifics, Congresswoman. I'm always in favor of transparency, but I want to make sure we're not creating more bureaucracy. Crockett smiled, a small, knowing smile that conveyed both patience and resolve. Of course, I'll make sure you have a copy of the bill by the end of the day. I look forward to your feedback. The exchange was being live-streamed, and within minutes, clips began circulating on social media. The hashtags #LetHerSpeak and #Crockett vs. Gaetz started trending as viewers across the country weighed in. Some praised Crockett's composure and focus, while others accused her of grandstanding. But even her critics had to admit she had managed to do what few others had. Hold Gaetz accountable, not with anger or theatrics, but with facts and persistence as the hearing continued. The dynamic between the two lawmakers became a focal point for the media. Pundits on cable news dissected every word, every gesture, every pause. On one network, a commentator remarked, "What we saw today was a masterclass in congressional oversight. Representative Crockett didn't just ask tough questions, she demanded real answers, and when she didn't get them, she let the silence speak for itself." On another channel, a panel debated whether Gaetz's approach was effective or self-defeating. "He's playing to his base," one analyst argued. "They love the interruptions, the confrontations, but at some point, you have to deliver substance, not just sound bites." Meanwhile, in the hearing room, Crockett continued her questioning, turning her attention to the witnesses. She asked pointed, well-researched questions about the process for awarding contracts, the safeguards in place to prevent fraud, and the steps being taken to ensure taxpayer dollars were spent wisely. Her tone was respectful but unyielding, her focus always on the facts. Gaetz, for his part, tried to regain his footing. He interjected during other members' questioning, tempted to redirect the conversation, and even made a few jokes at Crockett's expense. But the momentum had shifted. Each time he interrupted, the chair reminded him of the rules. Each time he tried to deflect, Crockett brought the conversation back to the issue at hand. Outside the hearing room, the story took on a life of its own. Editorials praised Crockett's performance, calling it a turning point in congressional discourse. Advocacy groups used clips from the hearing in fundraising emails, urging supporters to stand with leaders who demand accountability. Even late-night comedians got in on the act, replaying the exchange and poking fun at Gaetz's inability to answer a simple question. But for Crockett, the real victory was not in the headlines or the viral clips. It was in the message she sent to her colleagues, to her constituents, and to anyone who had ever been talked over or dismissed. She had shown that it was possible to stand your ground, to demand respect, and to insist on answers, even in the face of relentless opposition. As the hearing drew to a close, the chair thanked all the members for their participation and reminded them that the work of oversight was ongoing. Crockett gathered her papers, exchanged a few quiet words with her staff, and made her way out of the room. Reporters rushed to catch her for a comment, but she declined, saying only the facts speak for themselves. Gaetz lingered behind, surrounded by his aides. He gave a few interviews, insisting that he had raised important questions and held the administration accountable. But the sound bites rang hollow, overshadowed by the image of him for once, rendered speechless by a colleague who refused to be interrupted. In the days that followed, the hearing continued to dominate the news cycle. Editorial boards weighed in, some calling for more hearings, and others urging lawmakers to focus on solutions rather than spectacle. Social media buzzed with debate, as supporters and critics of both lawmakers argued over who had won the exchange. But for those who had watched the hearing unfold, the answer was clear. Jasmine Crockett had not only held her own against one of Congress's most notorious interrupters, she had set a new standard for what it means to demand accountability in the halls of power. The aftermath of the hearing rippled far beyond the marble halls of Congress. In living rooms, classrooms, and offices across the country, people replayed the exchange between Crockett and Gaetz, dissecting every moment. For some, it was a validation, a long overdue example of a woman refusing to be silenced, of a public servant demanding substance over spectacle. For others, it was a new front in the ongoing culture war, a symbol of the deep divisions that defined American politics. But for Jasmine Crockett, the experience was both personal and political. That evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the day's events, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in Dallas, she had learned early on that respect was not always given freely, especially to women of color. She had watched her mother navigate workplaces where her ideas were dismissed, her voice ignored. She had seen her community struggle for recognition, for justice, for a seat at the table. Those lessons had shaped her, had taught her to prepare twice as hard, to speak twice as clearly, to never back down in the face of adversity. Her journey to Congress had not been easy. As a civil rights attorney, she had spent years fighting for clients who had been overlooked or mistreated by the system. She had stood in courtrooms where her objections were overruled, her expertise questioned, her authority challenged. But she had also learned the power of persistence, the value of letting the facts speak, of using silence as a tool, of refusing to be rattled by bluster or intimidation. That day in the hearing room, all those lessons had come together. She had faced down one of the most aggressive voices in Congress, not by matching his volume, but by holding her ground. She had turned his interruptions into evidence of his evasiveness, his refusal to answer into a demonstration of her own resolve, and in doing so, she had given voice to countless others who had been talked over, dismissed, or ignored. The response from her constituents was immediate and overwhelming. Her office was flooded with calls and emails, many from women who had watched the hearing and seen themselves in her. "Thank you for not letting him talk over you," one message read. "You showed my daughter what it means to stand up for yourself." Another wrote, "I've been in meetings where men like Gaetz try to dominate the conversation. You gave me hope that things can change." Crockett read every message, her heart swelling with both pride and responsibility. She knew that her actions had resonated far beyond the committee room, that she had become, for many, a symbol of what was possible when preparation met opportunity. But she also knew that the work was far from over. The issues at the heart of the hearing, government oversight, accountability, the responsible use of taxpayer dollars, were not solved in a single exchange. They required ongoing vigilance, continued advocacy, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Meanwhile, Matt Gaetz faced a different kind of reckoning. In the days following the hearing, he appeared on several news programs attempting to reframe the narrative. "I was just trying to get answers," he insisted. The Democrats don't want to talk about the real issues at the border, but the clips of him interrupting, deflecting, and ultimately failing to provide evidence played on a loop, undermining his message. Even some of his usual allies in the media acknowledged that he had been outmaneuvered. The contrast between the two lawmakers could not have been starker. Crockett, calm and composed, focused on facts and solutions. Gaetz, combative and evasive, more interested in scoring points than in providing answers. The public took notice. Polls showed a spike in Crockett's approval ratings, especially among independent voters and women. Editorials praised her grace under pressure and called for more leaders who prioritized substance over showmanship. But Crockett was not interested in personal accolades. In interviews, she deflected questions about her viral moment, redirecting the conversation to the issues at hand. "This isn't about me," she told one reporter. "It's about making sure our government works for the people. It's about demanding accountability no matter who's in power." Her approach resonated with a broad cross-section of Americans. Advocacy groups invited her to speak at events on transparency and good governance. Universities asked her to guest lecture on the importance of oversight. Even some of her colleagues across the aisle privately expressed admiration for her performance, acknowledging that she had raised the bar for congressional discourse. In the weeks that followed, Crockett continued to push for reforms. She worked with colleagues to draft bipartisan legislation aimed at increasing transparency in federal contracting. She met with watchdog groups to discuss best practices for oversight. She held town halls in her district, listening to constituents' concerns and sharing her vision for a more accountable government. The hearing had also sparked a broader conversation about the role of women in politics. On social media, the hashtag #LetHerSpeak became a rallying cry for those who had experienced similar challenges. Women from all walks of life shared stories of being interrupted in meetings, dismissed in classrooms, or talked over in public forums. Crockett's example became a touchstone, a reminder that it was possible to reclaim your time, to insist on being heard, to turn interruption into opportunity. The cultural impact was undeniable. Late-night hosts joked about Gaetz's 5 interruptions and a knockout, while editorial cartoons depicted Crockett as a modern-day David facing down a congressional Goliath. But beneath the humor was a serious message: the importance of respect, the value of listening, and the need for leaders who put the public good above personal ambition. For Crockett, the experience was both humbling and motivating. She knew that every time she spoke, she was not just representing her district, but also setting an example for others. She was determined to use her platform to advocate for those whose voices had too often been ignored. As she prepared for the next round of hearings, Crockett reflected on the lessons of that day. She knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more attempts to distract, deflect, and dominate. But she also knew that she was ready. She had faced down the interruptions, the evasions, the theatrics, and she had emerged stronger, more determined, and more committed than ever to the work of holding power accountable. The days after the hearing saw a flurry of activity not just in Washington, but across the country. News outlets replayed the exchange between Crockett and Gaetz, analyzing it from every angle. Political podcasts devoted entire episodes to the moment, with hosts marveling at Crockett's poise and dissecting Gaetz's strategy. In classrooms, teachers used the clip as a case study in debate, asking students to consider the importance of evidence, the power of silence, and the dynamics of interruption. But the impact was not limited to the media. In community centers and living rooms, people talked about what they had seen. For many, it was a moment of catharsis, a public reckoning with the kind of behavior that too often goes unchecked. Women who had been interrupted in boardrooms, students who had been talked over in class, activists who had been dismissed at town halls, all saw something of themselves in Crockett's calm refusal to be sidelined. In Dallas, Crockett's home district, the response was especially strong. Local newspapers ran editorials praising her performance, and community leaders organized forums to discuss the broader issues raised by the hearing. At one such event, a high school senior named Maya stood up and addressed the crowd. "Watching Representative Crockett stand her ground made me feel like I could do the same," she said. "It's not just about politics. It's about respect. It's about being heard." Crockett herself was moved by the outpouring of support. She made a point of visiting schools and community centers, listening to young people's stories and encouraging them to speak up. "Your voice matters," she told them. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. If someone tries to talk over you, remember you have every right to reclaim your time." Meanwhile, in Washington, the political fallout continued. Gaetz's office released a statement, insisting that he had raised important questions and held the administration accountable. But the statement was quickly overshadowed by the viral clips of his repeated interruptions and his inability to provide evidence. Even some of his Republican colleagues privately expressed frustration, worried that his antics were undermining the party's credibility on oversight. The contrast between Crockett and Gaetz became a talking point in political circles. At a bipartisan dinner, A senior senator remarked, "We could use a little more of Crockett's approach around here. Less noise, more substance." The comment drew nods from both sides of the aisle, a rare moment of agreement in an otherwise divided Congress. Crockett's colleagues took notice as well. Several reached out to her, seeking advice on how to handle difficult hearings. She shared her strategies: preparation, patience, and the willingness to let silence do the work when words fail. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait," she explained. "Let the other person reveal themselves. Don't rush to fill the silence. Use it." Her approach began to influence the tone of other hearings. Lawmakers who had previously relied on bluster and interruption found themselves facing a new kind of resistance, one rooted in composure and clarity. The old playbook of dominating the conversation was no longer as effective. The rules were changing, and Crockett was at the forefront of that change. The hearing also sparked renewed interest in the issue of government oversight. Advocacy groups seized the moment, launching campaigns to demand greater transparency in federal contracting. Petitions circulated, calling for independent audits and stronger safeguards against waste and fraud. Crockett's office worked closely with these groups, providing data and helping to draft policy proposals. In the weeks that followed, Crockett introduced a bill aimed at increasing transparency in federal contracts. The legislation called for regular audits, public reporting of contract awards, and stricter penalties for violations. The bill quickly gained bipartisan support, with several Republicans signing on as co-sponsors. "This isn't about party," Crockett said at a press conference. "It's about making sure taxpayer dollars are spent wisely and responsibly." The bill's progress was closely watched by the media. Editorials praised its common-sense approach, and advocacy groups urged lawmakers to pass it without delay. Crockett appeared on several news programs, explaining the importance of oversight and the need for accountability. Her calm, measured tone stood in stark contrast to the heated rhetoric that often dominated the airwaves. As the bill moved through committee, Crockett continued to engage with her constituents. She held town halls, answered questions, and listened to concerns. She made it clear that her focus was on results, not headlines. "I'm not interested in viral moments for their own sake," she told one audience. "I want to make a difference. I want to make sure our government works for everyone." The response was overwhelmingly positive. Constituents appreciated her transparency and her willingness to listen. Many said they felt more connected to their government, more confident that their voices were being heard. "She's the real deal," one voter remarked. "She doesn't just talk about accountability, she lives it." Meanwhile, Gaetz struggled to regain his footing. He continued to make appearances on cable news, but the narrative had shifted. Instead of being seen as a fearless watchdog, he was increasingly viewed as a disruptor without a cause. His interruptions, once a hallmark of his style, now seemed more like a liability than an asset. The contrast between the two lawmakers became a case study in leadership. Crockett's approach, rooted in preparation, respect, and persistence, stood in sharp relief against Gaetz's reliance on theatrics and confrontation. The public took notice, and the lesson was clear. Substance mattered. Facts mattered. And in the end, the truth had a way of making itself heard. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of the hearing continued to reverberate. Crockett's bill passed the House with broad support, a rare example of bipartisan cooperation in a polarized Congress. The legislation was hailed as a victory for good governance, and Crockett was invited to speak at national conferences on transparency and accountability. But for Crockett, the real reward was the knowledge that she had made a difference, not just in the halls of Congress, but in the lives of the people she served. She had shown that it was possible to stand up to interruption, to demand answers, and to insist on respect. And in doing so, she had inspired others to do the same. As the story of the hearing continued to ripple outward, it became clear that the moment between Jasmine Crockett and Matt Gaetz had struck a chord far beyond the world of politics. In the weeks that followed, the exchange was referenced in op-eds, discussed in podcasts, and even dramatized in late-night comedy sketches. But for many, the true significance of the moment lay not in its entertainment value, but in the deeper questions it raised about power, voice, and the nature of public service. In one particularly poignant segment on a national radio show, callers were invited to share their own experiences of being interrupted or dismissed. The phone lines lit up with stories from women, people of color, and young professionals who had faced similar challenges in their own lives. One caller, a nurse from Ohio, described how she had been talked over in staff meetings, her expertise questioned despite years of experience. "Watching Representative Crockett stand her ground gave me hope," she said. "It reminded me that I have a right to be heard." Another caller, a high school debate coach from California, explained how she had used the hearing as a teaching tool. "I showed my students the clip and asked them to analyze the strategies each person used. We talked about the importance of evidence, the power of silence, and the difference between speaking loudly and speaking effectively. It was one of the best discussions we've ever had. The impact was not limited to individuals. Organizations dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion began using the hearing as a case study in their training programs. Workshops on workplace communication referenced Crockett's approach, emphasizing the importance of preparation, composure, and the strategic use of silence. "This is what it looks like to reclaim your time," one facilitator explained. "You don't have to match aggression with aggression. Sometimes the most powerful response is to let the other person reveal themselves." In Congress, the hearing became a touchstone for ongoing debates about oversight and accountability. Lawmakers from both parties cited the exchange as an example of how hearings should be conducted, focused on facts, respectful of process, and committed to getting real answers. Crockett's bill on contract transparency continued to gain support, with new co-sponsors signing on each week. The legislation was seen as a model for how to address complex issues without resorting to partisan bickering. But the moment also sparked a broader conversation about the role of women in leadership. Editorials praised Crockett's unflappable composure and called for more women to be given opportunities to lead. Advocacy groups highlighted the hearing as evidence of the need for greater representation in government, business, and beyond. "When women are at the table, the conversation changes," one op declared. "We need more leaders like Jasmine Crockett, leaders who listen, who prepare, and who refuse to be silenced." Crockett herself was both humbled and energized by the response. She received invitations to speak at conferences, universities, and community events across the country. At each stop, she emphasized the same message: the importance of preparation, the value of listening, and the need to hold power accountable. "It's not about me," she told audiences. "It's about all of us. It's about making sure that every voice is heard, that every question gets an answer, and that our government works for the people." Her message resonated. At a town hall in Dallas, a young woman approached her after the event, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for showing us what's possible," she said. "You made me believe that I can make a difference too." Crockett hugged her, reminded once again of the responsibility she carried, not just to her constituents, but to everyone who looked to her as an example. Meanwhile, Matt Gaetz found himself facing new challenges. The viral clips of the hearing had damaged his reputation, even among some of his supporters. Editorials questioned his effectiveness, and late-night hosts lampooned his style. In private, some of his colleagues urged him to reconsider his approach, warning that the old tactics of interruption and deflection were losing their impact. Gaetz, however, was undeterred. He doubled down on his combative style, appearing on talk shows and social media to defend his record. "I'm not going to apologize for asking tough questions," he insisted. "The American people deserve answers." But the narrative had shifted. Each new outburst was met with skepticism, each interruption with criticism. The contrast with Crockett's approach was impossible to ignore. The hearing also had a lasting impact on the culture of Congress itself. Lawmakers began to rethink their strategies, recognizing that the public was paying closer attention than ever before. The days of grandstanding for the cameras were not over, but there was a growing awareness that substance mattered. Voters wanted answers, not just theatrics. They wanted leaders who listened, who prepared, who respected the process. Crockett's influence extended beyond the hearing room. She became a mentor to younger lawmakers, especially women and people of color. She shared her experiences, offered advice, and encouraged them to find their own voices. "Don't let anyone define you by their expectations," she told them. "You have a right to be here. You have a right to be heard." Her example inspired a new generation of leaders. Young women ran for office, citing Crockett as their role model. Students organized debates and forums, determined to create spaces where every voice could be heard. Community groups launched initiatives to promote civic engagement, using the hearing as a rallying point. The legacy of the hearing was not just in the headlines or the viral clips. It was in the quiet moments of reflection, the conversations sparked, the lives changed. It was in the realization that power could be challenged, that voices could be reclaimed, that respect could be demanded and received. As the months passed, the story of Jasmine Crockett and Matt Gaetz became part of the larger narrative of American democracy. It was a reminder that the work of holding power accountable was never finished, that every generation had to fight for its voice, its rights, its place at the table. And it was a testament to the enduring power of preparation, persistence, and the simple act of refusing to be interrupted. As the seasons changed and the initial buzz of the hearing faded from the headlines, its influence continued to shape the political landscape in subtle but profound ways. Jasmine Crockett's name became synonymous with a new style of leadership, one that valued substance over spectacle and composure over confrontation. Her approach was studied in political science courses, cited in leadership seminars, and referenced in op-eds as a model for effective public service. In Washington, the ripple effects were unmistakable. Committee chairs began to enforce rules of decorum more strictly, reminding members that respect for the process was not optional. Lawmakers who had once relied on bluster and interruption found themselves facing a new kind of scrutiny, not just from their colleagues but from a public that had grown weary of empty theatrics. The hearing had set a new standard, and those who failed to meet it risked being left behind. Crockett's influence extended beyond the halls of Congress. In her district, she continued to engage with constituents, holding regular town halls and listening sessions. She made a point of visiting schools, community centers, and local businesses, always emphasizing the importance of civic engagement. Democracy isn't a spectator sport, she told one group of high school students. It's something we all have to participate in every day. Her message resonated, especially with young people. Voter registration drives saw a surge in participation, and local organizations reported increased interest in public service careers. Teachers incorporated the hearing into their civics lessons, using it as a springboard for discussions about government, accountability, and the power of individual action. Meanwhile, Crockett's bill on contract transparency made its way through the Senate, where it faced new challenges. Some lawmakers raised concerns about the potential for increased bureaucracy, while others questioned whether the proposed audits would be effective. Crockett responded with her trademark patience and preparation, meeting with senators from both parties, addressing their concerns, and providing detailed data to support her case. Her efforts paid off. After a series of amendments and negotiations, the bill passed with bipartisan support. The president signed it into law in a ceremony attended by lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, advocacy groups, and members of the public. In her remarks, Crockett emphasized that the victory belonged not to any one person or party, but to the American people. "This is what happens when we work together," she said. "When we listen, when we prepare, when we hold each other accountable." The new law brought immediate changes. Federal agencies implemented stricter oversight procedures, and independent audits became the norm rather than the exception. Reports of waste and mismanagement declined, and public confidence in government oversight began to recover. Advocacy groups hailed the legislation as a major step forward, and editorial boards praised Crockett's leadership. But Crockett was not content to rest on her laurels. She continued to push for reforms in other areas, from voting rights to criminal justice. She built coalitions across party lines, always focused on finding common ground. Her approach was pragmatic, but never cynical. She believed that progress was possible, even in a divided Congress, if lawmakers were willing to put in the work. Her relationship with Matt Gaetz remained complicated. While their public exchanges were often contentious, there was a grudging respect between them. Gaetz, for his part, began to moderate his tone in committee hearings, focusing more on substantive questions and less on theatrics. He still disagreed with Crockett on many issues, but he could not ignore the impact she had made. In private, Gaetz admitted to colleagues that the hearing had been a turning point. "She caught me off guard," he confided to a fellow lawmaker. "I thought I could control the narrative, but she was too prepared, too focused. I underestimated her, and I paid the price." The admission was rare, but it spoke to the power of the moment, and to the lessons learned on both sides. The hearing also inspired a new wave of activism. Grassroots organizations used the story as a rallying point, encouraging members to speak up at public meetings, to demand answers from elected officials, and to hold power accountable at every level. The phrase Crockett moment entered the political lexicon, shorthand for any instance in which someone calmly and effectively stood their ground in the face of interruption or disrespect in the media. The story continued to resonate. Documentaries explored the broader implications of the hearing, interviewing experts on communication, leadership, and gender dynamics. Podcasts featured in-depth discussions with Crockett, Gaetz, and other key players, offering listeners a behind-the-scenes look at how the moment had unfolded. The narrative was clear. The hearing was more than just a viral clip. It was a catalyst for change. Crockett's personal life was also touched by the experience. She received letters from across the country, many from young women who saw her as a role model. Some shared stories of overcoming adversity, while others simply expressed gratitude for her example. Crockett read each letter, often responding with words of encouragement and advice. She understood the responsibility that came with her platform, and she was determined to use it wisely. As the anniversary of the hearing approached, Crockett reflected on the journey. She knew that the work of accountability was never finished. Every victory was only a step toward a more just and equitable society. But she also knew that moments like the one she had shared with Gaetz could make a difference, that they could inspire, challenge, and ultimately change the way people thought about power and leadership. The legacy of the hearing was not just in the laws passed or the headlines written. It was in the lives touched, the conversations sparked, and the examples set for future generations. It was a reminder that even in the most contentious of times, it was possible to stand up, speak out, and make your voice heard. The one-year anniversary of the hearing arrived with little fanfare in the halls of Congress. But outside those walls, the moment was far from forgotten. In Dallas, a local university hosted a public forum titled The Power of Persistence: Lessons from the Crockett Gaetz Hearing. The event drew students, activists, and community leaders, all eager to reflect on the impact of that day and the changes it had set in motion. Jasmine Crockett was the keynote speaker, and as she took the stage, the applause was long and heartfelt. She began her remarks not with a victory lap, but with humility. "I didn't set out to make headlines," she told the audience. "I set out to get answers. I set out to do my job." She spoke about the importance of preparation, the value of listening, and the courage it takes to stand your ground when the pressure is on. She acknowledged the challenges she had faced, not just in that hearing, but throughout her career. And she encouraged others to find their own voices, to speak up even when it was difficult. The forum was more than a celebration. It was a call to action. Panelists discussed the ongoing need for oversight and transparency, the importance of civic engagement, and the ways in which ordinary people could hold their leaders accountable. Students asked thoughtful questions about leadership, resilience, and the future of American democracy. Crockett answered each one with candor, drawing on her own experiences and the lessons she had learned along the way. Meanwhile, in Washington, the effects of the hearing continued to ripple through the corridors of power. Lawmakers who had once dismissed the importance of decorum now found themselves under greater scrutiny. Committee chairs enforced time limits and rules of order with renewed vigor. The public, empowered by the example set in that hearing room, demanded more from their representatives, more answers, more respect, more accountability. Matt Gaetz, for his part, had changed as well. While he remained a polarizing figure, he had become more measured in his approach. In subsequent hearings, he focused on substantive questions, often citing the need for evidence and clarity. He still disagreed with Crockett on many issues, but he no longer relied on interruption as his primary tactic. In a rare moment of candor during a televised interview, he admitted that day taught me something. You can't win an argument by talking over someone who's prepared. You have to bring facts. You have to listen. The media continued to revisit the hearing, especially as new challenges arose in Congress. Editorials called for more leaders like Crockett, leaders who valued substance over spectacle, who listened as much as they spoke, who understood that true power lay not in dominating the conversation, but in elevating it. Documentaries chronicled the story, interviewing not just the lawmakers involved, but also the staffers, journalists, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by what they saw in classrooms across the country. Teachers used the hearing as a teaching tool. Students analyzed the strategies employed by both Crockett and Gaetz, discussing the importance of preparation, the role of evidence, and the impact of tone and body language. They debated the merits of different approaches to leadership, and many came away with a deeper appreciation for the complexities of public service. Crockett's influence extended beyond politics. She became a sought-after speaker at leadership conferences, women's summits, and civic engagement workshops. Her message was always the same: preparation is power. Respect is non-negotiable, and silence, when used wisely, can be the most powerful statement of all. She encouraged her audiences to do their homework, to listen before speaking, and to never let anyone define their worth by the volume of their voice. The story of the hearing also found its way into popular culture. Writers referenced it in novels and essays, artists depicted it in murals and illustrations, and musicians wrote songs inspired by the themes of persistence and resilience. The phrase, Crockett moment, became shorthand for any instance in which someone calmly and effectively stood their ground in the face of adversity. But for Jasmine Crockett, the true legacy of that day was not in the accolades or the headlines. It was in the quiet moments, the letters from young women who had found their voice, the conversations with constituents who felt seen and heard, the knowledge that she had made a difference, however small, in the lives of those she served. She continued her work in Congress with the same dedication and focus that had defined her career. She championed causes that mattered to her district, from education to healthcare to criminal justice reform. She built coalitions, reached across the aisle, and never lost sight of the people who had sent her to Washington. She knew that every hearing, every vote, every conversation was an opportunity to make a difference. As the sun set on the anniversary of the hearing, Crockett returned to her office, tired but content. She reflected on the journey, the challenges faced, the lessons learned, the victories won, and the setbacks endured. She knew that the work was far from over, that new challenges would arise, that the fight for accountability and respect would continue, but she also knew that she was ready in the end. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Matt Gaetz was not just about a single hearing or a viral moment. It was about the enduring power of preparation, the importance of listening, and the courage to stand your ground. It was about the belief that every voice matters, that every question deserves an answer, and that true leadership is measured not by the ability to dominate, but by the willingness to serve. As she turned off the lights and prepared to leave for the night, Crockett paused for a moment, looking out over the city. She thought of the people she represented, the challenges they faced, the hopes they carried. She thought of the young women who had written to her, students who had studied her example, the colleagues who had learned from her approach, and she smiled, knowing that, in some small way, she had helped to change the conversation. The legacy of that day would live on, not just in the laws passed or the headlines written, but in the lives touched, the voices empowered, and the examples set for generations to come. In a world too often defined by noise and division, Jasmine Crockett had shown that it was possible to rise above, to demand respect, and to make your voice heard. And in doing so, she had reminded us all of the power of persistence, the value of preparation, and the simple, enduring truth that sometimes the most powerful response is the one that leaves your opponent speechless.